Hello everyone, welcome to Pearson Education's webinar, Assessing Silent Reading Rate with Comprehension. My name is Rebecca Hall and I'm facilitating this session from our Pearson office in Austin, Texas. Before we begin today, I'd just like to familiarize you with a few items in our GoToWebinar platform. First, as an attendee, you are able to listen to the audio portion through either your computer speakers or through your telephone by choosing one of those two options in your audio panel. Because we are recording today's session, all lines have been automatically muted. We do encourage you, however, to send in your questions using the question feature in your control panel. Simply type your question in a question box and click send. Those questions will come to us and we will have a chance to moderate those at the end of today's session. So now I would like to introduce our presenters for today. Dr. Freddie Hiebert is a literacy expert and the president of Text Project, Inc. She has a long career as a literacy educator, from teacher's aide to teacher of primary level students, and then to teacher educator and researcher at the universities of Kentucky, Colorado Boulder, Michigan, and California, Berkeley. Her research, which addresses how fluency, vocabulary, and knowledge can be fostered through appropriate texts, has been published in numerous scholarly journals and books. And our own Dr. Mark Daniel has spent more than 30 years working with assessments in both the test development and psychometric areas, and currently as a senior scientist for research and innovation. We're so happy to have you both with us today, and without further ado, Mark, I would like to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you all today, this afternoon. I'd like to start off with an outline of what this first part of the presentation will be. And I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then Freddie will take over and talk for another 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm going to start by covering the basics of the concept of what silent reading fluency is attempting to measure and what implications it has for reading comprehension and applications in the classroom. So I'm going to start with the concept that we're trying to measure with this test, which is an interesting and thing that may be more complicated than perhaps many of us might have thought before we got into this area. I'll talk briefly about what the history of research and assessment is in silent reading fluency, talk about the challenges of measuring silent reading rate, and the challenge particularly is how to incorporate comprehension in this measure. Talk about how the aimsweb Silent Reading Fluency measure tackles this challenge, and then address the big question, is silent reading fluency a reading comprehension test? And I'll present some arguments and evidence to suggest that the efficiency of reading with comprehension is what it is primarily measuring for the great majority of students, but it also for some students taps into the distinction between what they can comprehend and what they do comprehend when they're reading. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about the applications of these findings to using the silent reading fluency test. So the concept is called comprehension-based silent reading rate, or if we leave the rate part off, we're talking about comprehension-based silent reading, which is the essence of reading. And this is a term that Freddie and colleagues had introduced several years ago. It means getting meaning while you're reading in real time, not going back and analyzing the text later to answer a question, but understanding the gist and following the line of reasoning in the text, making simple inferences, close inferences, integrating ideas the way you would do if you're reading a novel, reading a magazine article, reading a blog. So comprehension-based silent reading is the essence of reading, and certainly for students at the middle, elementary years and above, it's what they are primarily doing in their academic work. So it's efficiency of gaining meaning while reading. It's important, partly because being able to gain meaning efficiently is bound to be helpful in many academic areas. Also because rate measures, such as silent reading fluency, that are scored in terms of something like words per minute, are more sensitive to growth than strictly measures that are scored simply on accuracy. And so they're more useful for progress monitoring. And finally, the rate of reading with comprehension, or that efficiency score, is a good indicator of general reading ability. There's a long but not very dense history of research on silent reading rate. Started over 100 years ago with Huey's work on automaticity. In the 1950s and 60s, some of you may be as old as I am and remember the big craze over getting people to read very, very rapidly. Carver's research for the 60s through the 90s was really the major area of research on silent reading rate. He investigated the notion that there's an optimum rate of reading for comprehension efficiency and published some estimated norms for national norms for reading rate for students at different grade levels. In 2000, the National Reading Panel called attention to the importance of fluency in reading, and that was very influential in terms of practice over the next 10 or 15 years in terms of schools attending quite a bit to fluency in instruction and also in assessment through oral reading fluency measures. There's been an acceleration in research in recent years because eye tracking technology is now making it possible to monitor comprehension or come close to monitoring comprehension during silent reading. So the major takeaway is that there's been a long-standing interest in rate of silent reading with comprehension, but not a lot of deep research on it so far. The challenge of measuring comprehension-based silent reading rate is that the student must comprehend by definition because it's comprehension-based. What we want to know is at what rate does the student read when they are understanding what they're reading. If comprehension isn't high, then the rate measure really doesn't tell us very much. But the problem is that comprehension isn't directly observable. So the measurement challenge is how do we get students to read with a high level of comprehension? How do we monitor that level of comprehension? And at the same time keep the task realistic? And the attempts to measure comprehension-based silent reading rate typically have problems with one or more of these areas. How does aimswebPlus silent reading fluency address this? The essential features of this measure are first that it includes embedded comprehension questions in the reading, and secondly that it requires the student to answer those questions without looking back at the text. So for those, I'm sure that many of you have seen this, but I want to make sure that everyone is familiar, so I'm going to very quickly just go through one of the stories in Silent Reading Fluency for grade 4. So the student first sees this instruction screen, which they can listen to or read. So they first read that sentence at the bottom of the screen. When they're ready, they click Next, and they answer this question. And then they're immediately told whether they were correct or incorrect, and that correct or incorrect signal shows up for about 1 second on the screen. Then they get a second sentence, which they read again. As soon as they read it, they click Next and answer another question and immediately get feedback. So then they go, this is what they see before they actually do the test itself. And you can see that there's an emphasis on trying to answer correctly. There's a subtle emphasis on reading quickly. This is not presented as a strong motivation to read fast. It's primarily presented as something that they should do as quickly as they can, but they should focus primarily on understanding what they're reading so they can answer the questions correctly. So here's the first story. There are 2 more segments and questions, and then at the end of the story, they get feedback telling them how many they had correct on that particular story, and encouraging them to try to get at least 3 correct on each subsequent story. Okay. The score is based entirely on how much time they spent on the text segments and the number of words in each of those segments. So it's words per minute, the number of words in a segment divided by the time they spent, number of seconds they spent on that segment before clicking Next multiplied by 60. So, and then there's a words per minute score for each segment, and then those are averaged to get a words per minute score for the story, and then those are averaged overall to get an overall words per minute score for the 3 stories that make up the entire test. So how does, having seen this, how does Silent Reading Fluency address the measurement challenges that I mentioned before? First of all, the tasks, the reading is fairly realistic, and there's no artificial activity that the student has to do, such as drawing slashes between letters or underlining or filling in blanks. The segments are brief, which minimizes memory demands and also allows for lots of different measures, lots of different samplings of their performance. The segments are connected by a story, which helps to maintain interest. These stories are written at grade level. The students can't look back, so they must attend as they are reading. And I included this quotation, which is what is commonly heard when you administer this in a one-on-one situation. After they've done the first couple of items, they sort of like, oh, I better pay attention. And then finally, there's feedback to encourage them to comprehend, both after each question and after each story. And finally, the questions are very easy if the student comprehended each of the sentences in the segment. The segments are written specifically so that they don't contain much redundancy. Each sentence tends to give new information. So it really is impossible to be confident of being able to answer the question unless you've read all and understood all sentences. But the questions are very easy. They don't require higher level reasoning skills, inferencing, that sort of thing. The purpose of the questions, it's important to remember, is to motivate the students to pay attention while they're reading and to understand as they're reading. And this is evidence that shows just how easy the questions are. So you can see that this, from Tryout, the average p-values for the questions were in the high 80s to low 90s. And after Tryout, we did tend to drop or revise some of the questions that were the more difficult ones. So the questions are very, very easy across the board. And another way of looking at this is the number correct per story out of 4 questions. And you can see that the majority of students get all 4 questions right on most stories. The score, again, is based on the words per minute, averaged across the 12 different segments in the test. And this score is highly reliable. It's fairly stable across fall to winter or winter to spring. Correlates with a standard traditional passage comprehension test, about 0.5, which is in this data sample a little bit lower than oral reading fluency. In both of these instances, the correlations are a little bit lower than one would typically see, and so I think if this was done in another sample with different assessments, these correlations would both be a bit higher, and also correlates fairly strongly with oral reading fluency. This shows the relationship with oral reading fluency. The red line is the identity line, so that would be equal rates on oral reading fluency, which is the horizontal axis, and silent reading fluency, which is the vertical. And you can see that for the bulk of the score range, the silent reading fluency rate is a little bit higher, but not a great deal different from the oral reading fluency rate. This is indicating sensitivity to growth. So one of the main purposes of the silent reading fluency measure was to have a tool that would be a good, valid measure of reading ability that also would be sensitive to growth and be useful, therefore, for progress monitoring. And this compares the sensitivity to growth of the silent reading fluency measure with oral reading fluency. So silent reading fluency in blue. The growth from fall to spring tends to be a little bit lower on silent reading fluency than on oral reading fluency, but they're very close in terms of the amount of growth across the year. So from what you've seen, you may be thinking about, well, is this what I call this a measure of reading comprehension? One way to think about this is to think about what we mean by comprehension. And we can look at a continuum of comprehension demands from different kinds of tests, starting with oral reading fluency tests. where comprehension can be helpful, but the test is largely measuring decoding ability, and so comprehension is not required to be able to perform that task. Nevertheless, oral reading fluency is quite strongly related to traditional comprehension tests. In the middle, we have comprehension-based silent reading, in which comprehension is required, but it's a type of comprehension that is getting the gist, following the ideas, making close inferences, integrating information. And then finally, we have traditional passage comprehension testing, which tends to put a premium on more challenging text and more challenging questions that require higher level skills, such as more deep analyses of the text, more far inferences, and so on. So I would say that certainly comprehension is a required element of silent reading fluency because it measures comprehension-based silent reading rate. But it's a type of comprehension which is more like the comprehension that people engage in when they are actually reading for pleasure or non-technical kind of reading. So from a traditional passage comprehension test, we might say that we get information about, can the student answer challenging questions about challenging text? From the silent reading fluency measure, it's a little bit more complicated because it depends on whether or not the student did in fact perform with comprehension. If they did, then we're getting a measure of how efficiently the student read with comprehension, which is strongly related to reading ability. If they did not, then we're getting a different kind of information, and I'll present some evidence. Most of the rest of this section of the presentation is going to be about what is going on in that situation. It may be telling us more about, does the student read with comprehension when they're reading silently, when they're reading something that they're capable of comprehending, but for some reason they may perhaps choose or fail to comprehend. So these findings are based on a study done a year ago in a 6th grade in a southeastern U.S. small city. Had very nationally typical distributions of SES and race ethnicity. And we tested 61 grade 6 students. We gave them a traditional reading ability test, a grade, which includes, has a total score which for this study is made up of passage comprehension and vocabulary. And we also gave them all the online silent reading fluency test, the standard test, although we modified it so that instead of 3 stories, it includes 6 stories. And we did that for several reasons, including wanting to evaluate the impact of text difficulty. I won't get into that in this particular presentation, but you should note that there were some grade 6 stories in this test and also some grade 4 stories. So these are the results in terms of the accuracy on the silent reading fluency online. And as very similar to what we looked at a few minutes ago from the tryout of SRF, we've got roughly half of the students being perfectly accurate, another fourth of the students getting one wrong, and then the remaining students spread across 2 wrong down to almost half of the questions wrong, which is quite low accuracy. So there was the typical kind of finding with respect to the distribution of accuracy. And this is going to show how the rate score on silent reading fluency correlates with or is related to these students' reading ability as indicated by the grade total score, the combination of passage comprehension and vocabulary. And it's going to show this for each of these accuracy subgroups one at a time. So first looking at the students who were perfectly accurate on silent reading fluency. And there we see a fairly strong correlation of 61 between their rate on silent reading fluency and their grade score. Now if we look at students who had 1 error, again we have a strong correlation, 65, between their rate on silent reading fluency and their grade measured reading ability, and notice that their rate is a bit higher than for the students who had 100% correct on silent reading fluency. So for the same reading ability as measured by grade, students read a bit faster if they made one error than if they made no errors. What if they made 2 errors? Again, the correlation is quite strong, and again, they are faster still. And finally, if we look at students who made 3 to about, I think, 5 errors or so, you see the correlation begins to drop off, but the trend is parallel to, and again, faster rate than for the other levels of accuracy. So this is very interesting because it's telling us that even in this fairly narrow range of accuracy between 82% correct and 100% correct, there are some quite striking regularities in the relationship between accuracy and rate. So students are who are faster make more errors, and students who are slower are more accurate. So I want to look a little further into what is causing, or what is the significance of less than perfect accuracy on silent reading fluency. So here we're looking at the accuracy on silent reading fluency in the vertical axis plotted against the reading ability or grade total score. And what this is showing is that for students who are above average in reading ability, that is the right half of the graph, accuracy on silent reading fluency is almost always very high. For students who are below average in reading ability, it isn't the case that accuracy is low. Accuracy might be low or it might be high. There's quite a range of accuracy levels on silent reading fluency among students who are below average in general reading ability. So general reading ability clearly has a relationship to accuracy of comprehension on silent reading fluency, but it's not determinative. It's not a limiting factor in the normal sense that we would look at a correlation. So there's a lot of unexplained variation among the lower reading ability students in how accurately they perform silent reading fluency. So to dig further, we did a follow-up assessment of the students who were relatively less accurate. We called them the moderate to poor comprehenders, and there were 21 students who had 92% or less accuracy on the questions. And we gave them a one-on-one session about 2 weeks later. They did oral reading fluency, and they did another version, parallel in content, of silent reading fluency, but this time, instead of being shown on screens, the segments and the questions were shown on pieces of paper, and the student would simply flip through the pages as they went. The examiner would observe and would record the time of each page turn, so capturing the same information as in the online administration. And the examiner also gave feedback about accuracy after each story. So, what happened? This is, for a reminder, this is the accuracy distribution percentage correct on the online administration for the 21 students who were the poor to moderate comprehenders in online. And this is the accuracy of those same students when they did the same task, equivalent difficulty, with a one-on-one session with an examiner present. So the same students who were poor to mediocre in terms of their comprehension accuracy when they did it on computer were almost perfectly accurate on similar questions when it was given in a one-to-one setting. And in a one-to-one setting, the rate score that was obtained from these same students, now that they were performing at a very high level of accuracy, as you can see, correlates very highly in the 80s and low 90s with both the grade total score and also with oral reading fluency. These students who jump so dramatically in their accuracy between the online administration and the paper administration also tended to read more slowly in the paper administration, the one-on-one administration, about 20 words per minute slower. So this is a piece of information that suggests that these students are making a trade-off between their speed and their comprehension as they do the task. Here's another piece of information that supports that. This looks like a crazy graph, but it's showing for the poor comprehenders when they took Silent Reading Fluency online, and remember there were 6 stories, so we're seeing their performance, their rate and their accuracy across those 6 stories. So the gray line is telling us how fast they read, and they started off quite slowly, about 160 words per minute, which is a bit below average for that grade level. But they pretty quickly sped up to quite a rapid rate of 230 or so words per minute. And concurrently with that, their accuracy dropped quite a bit from a fairly decent level of accuracy of in the low 80%. It's not great, but still not bad, down to the 60% level in the 60s percent of accuracy. So these students appear to have made a decision or a choice to read more quickly as they went through the task, and at the cost of not understanding what they were reading. And this is another way of looking at that same phenomenon. Here, if we look at the 21 students who were in Phase 2 and who took the Silent Reading Fluency in the one-on-one situation, the students who had a perfect score read slower than the students who had 1 or 2 errors. So even in that narrow range of differences of accuracy, there's a quite notable relationship to speed. So the key findings: first, when students read Silent Reading Fluency content with good comprehension, their reading rate is strongly related to reading ability, and therefore this supports Silent Reading Fluency as the valid tool for progress monitoring as well as for screening. So there's evidence that we've shown in a number of these charts that the rate of reading, the sheer rate, once we know that students are reading with accuracy, is a good indicator of reading ability. And because it's a rate, it's useful for progress monitoring. Secondly, when students show poor comprehension on the questions, it's likely, at least from what we've seen in this set of data, that they are capable of comprehending these segments and answering correctly because they did so once the same sorts of questions were given in the one-on-one setting. But for some reason they choose not to. We don't know why. They might feel that it's too hard. These are the less proficient readers, and so reading for them may be more of a struggle. They may start off reading with comprehension, but decide they're reading, either decide that it's too much trouble, or they may decide that, gee, I'm reading too slowly, I better speed up. We don't know the answer in terms of why this is the case, but it is a very dramatic finding to see that students can read so much more with so much greater comprehension in just when the setting is different. So as far as using the Silent Reading Fluency online administration when comprehension is low, we would say this really points to the importance of focusing on comprehension in working with students, encouraging the students to take the time they need to understand what they're reading and to answer the questions correctly, because then their rate scores will become useful and become things that can be tracked and they can see them grow. Again, some students may feel that they need to read quickly, and that's something if that's the case, something to try to deal with and argue against if they are not showing good comprehension. And secondly, it's a practical option to use oral reading fluency rate as a substitute for silent reading fluency rate until we reach a point where the student's comprehension rises and silent reading fluency rate is valid. Oral reading fluency rates are close to, but a little bit lower than silent reading fluency rates. This is the relationship in the study that I just described to you. So you can see that for most of the score range, especially at the lower end of the range, the oral reading fluency rates are a little bit lower than the silent reading fluency rates. The orange line is the equal line. And so there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, but it's fairly close and it can be used as a short-term substitution. So now I'm going to turn it over to Freddie, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks for this really incredibly important information. What I want to do today is to talk about, so this is the overall distribution of the students in the large-scale application of the SRF assessment. What I want to do today is really talk about what is it that we do with the students who are having moderate comprehension. As Mark made the point, the questions really weren't that onerous, nor as somebody who studies text complexity would I argue that the texts are that incredibly hard, so we would have expected kids to do fairly well in terms of comprehension. Mark really focused on the kids here in the left-hand corner, those who are fast and inaccurate, showing this rapid reading pattern. But I want to make 3 points quickly today. My first one is, and Mark, maybe you want to turn off your mic.
All right.
Yeah. The first point that I want to make is that most students can recognize the majority of words. I think Mark's presentation really emphasized that. But I'm going to argue that what our kids are lacking is the ability to stay with the task. And I want to provide you some data that shows that. And I'm going to suggest that stamina in silent reading can be and needs to be taught. Now, Mark's concern really, in talking about the validity of the measure, this question about these inaccurate, really rapid readers really needs attention. But I also would suggest that we've got, about 60% of the kids who really have some issues with proficient silent reading behaviors. So I want to start by just underscoring the point that from every available data we have, including from special studies associated with the national assessment, we can conclude that most American kids can recognize the majority of the words in text. This comes from, based on thousands of kids on the Dibbles assessments, and what you're seeing are the 10, 25, and 50% word recognition accuracy in oral reading at the end of grade 3. So by the end of grade 3, what you're seeing is that even kids in the 10th percentile have made the 90% mark that experts such as Mari Clay and Steve Stahl said was our target in terms of basic comprehension. And it turns out at the end of grade 2, the 10% is at about 88%. Accuracy, and the 25th percent already has attained this level. But what you're seeing, and we can ask some questions, of course, about the Dibbles comprehension, but what you're seeing is comprehension is really poor. They are able to actually pronounce most of the words in a text. Second piece of evidence to say that kids are lacking in stamina. When we typically look at silent reading comprehension on measures such as the national assessment, which basically does comparisons across states, we see about a third of our kids, 36%, getting to the proficient level, sort of close to what we're seeing in terms of the kids who are doing very well on the comprehension measure on the silent reading fluency with comprehension assessment, but we're seeing the rest of the kids doing poorly in terms of their comprehension. We really don't know what's happening, right? Because on the national assessment, you get a long passage, you need to answer questions. But what my colleagues and I have done is we've actually looked at what kids are doing in sections of assessments. So what we've done is taken a 5-part passage, I mean, these are sections of a passage that are really coherent, followed by questions. And what we see is the kids in the bottom quartile read with reasonable rates in that first portion of the passage. And then they start engaging in what you saw as this rapid reading. You know, it's kind of like, I've given enough. You know, I gave it the office. We see that pattern with kids in the second from the bottom quartile. They stay with the passage for about 40% of it. And then kids in the top two quartiles, they finish the passage at the similar rate. Okay, so I hope that that made sense. What I'm saying here is that the kids in the bottom quartile are able to read the passage with pretty good comprehension and with a decent reading rate. But once they get to the other portions, they quickly start engaging in this disfluent silent reading behavior. Kids from the bottom quartile start doing that after the second set of passages, or the second chunk of passage. So what I've suggested is that our kids can actually recognize words, and typically when we start interventions, often we start really emphasizing things around decoding. And what I'm suggesting here is that what they're really lacking is focus and attention in silent reading. And I'm going to give you 4 actions for application in schools. I think any one of these actions would have an amazing effect in classrooms and in terms of kids' stamina. So basically what we're saying here is what you're seeing on statewide tests isn't that the kids can't read, it's that they don't read after a certain point. And if the passages are long, as they are in most state and tests and in the national assessment, it really doesn't help you if you only read part of the passage as a really attentive reader when all of the questions are at the end. So the first action that I'm going to suggest is that we decrease the amount of assisted reading and increase student reading of instructional text. I want to underscore here that what I'm talking about is instructional texts. I'm not talking about teachers reading aloud some really great texts, really great stories that they're communicating with their kids, or really great informational text. I'm talking about the text that states or districts or schools have purchased to help kids develop reading. What we've seen immensely in the last decade is that we've got a lot of teacher doing the reading for kids and asking the kids to follow along. And it turns out that this is even happening at the high school levels. So as part of the Reading for Understanding study, which was a big federal initiative to help understand how we can improve comprehension, Sharon Vaughn and her colleagues went into ELA, science and social studies classrooms in high school. And they found that there was a reasonable amount of reading going on. But actually, when they found out what kind of reading it was, it turned out that the majority of the reading was kids ostensibly, and I underscore that word ostensibly, following along as their teachers read the instructional text. And what I'm suggesting here is that as the texts are perceived to be harder, or as we perceive our kids to be less capable, it actually turns out teachers are doing a lot of the reading for kids. And I don't think we need to have research that says that when teachers do the reading, it's typically the teachers who are going to get better at the reading. So what I'm suggesting is we need to look for ways to increase kids' involvement in their own reading, more eyes on the text. One of the ways in which I think you do that is to actually talk with students about the presence of new words in text. Some research on eye movements of the same kind that I was showing you with those sections of passages indicates that when there are too many words that the kids don't think they know, that's one of the things that contributes to this dropping out or dropping off in terms of attentive reading. So one of the things that we've done at Text Project, the not-for-profit that I run, is to develop some sample conversations. So this is available at Text Project. Talking with kids that you're always going to see some new hard words in text. And we have a lot of information as a result of research on vocabulary that actually tells us how many hard words we can anticipate at different grade levels. So as a middle schooler, you're always going to have about 7 to 8 words you've probably not seen before. That doesn't mean you can't figure them out, but you have to be prepared for having those words. Third, is that giving kids consistent opportunities to read magazine articles is one way to really increase this, I'm responsible for my own reading. I don't need to go into the fact that magazine articles are the primary kind of text that are on assessments. I have a lot of reasons for reading magazines in classrooms beyond this. First of all, it gives kids great background knowledge. Magazine articles are typically intact, and you can develop a complete idea in that article. And for kids who haven't been doing a great deal of their own reading, it's a manageable task to see a magazine article. Now, one of the things we've done at Text Project to support this reading of magazine articles is we provided a set of about 100 open access, that means they're for free download, texts that are really geared to ensuring that kids get a lot of exposure to the core vocabulary, the words that account for the majority of the words in text. Okay, so we've got about 100 of these different passages. They're on lots of topics that give you background knowledge, including human interest stories about American kids. So you can read about kids like yourself who are doing interesting things. Another source for fabulous magazine articles is readworks.org. And in fact, again, open access, all free downloads at this site. And ReadWorks has actually been sponsoring an initiative called An Article a Day, and they've been clustering sets of articles thematically. Here's an example of some that I've clustered from the site on architecture and engineering. There are lots of interesting topics that we can engage kids in. So the third idea was have kids read magazine articles. It's a great way to increase kids' responsibility for text. It also helps you develop background knowledge, and they're really interesting. We've had great responses from kids who have been involved in this Article a Day initiative. Finally, consistently help kids to remember what they've read and why we read. We read to learn things. Narratives, we read to learn about the human condition. And informational text, we read to find out, oh, by the way, this is supposed to be a brain synapses. But we read to get knowledge about so many different parts of our world, right? About weather and clothing and courage and all kinds of things, animals. So we want kids to have opportunities guided by their teachers initially and then more and more on their own. For example, in the ReadWorks An Article a Day, kids have their own knowledge books where they actually record what it is that they've learned. Why is it that we read? We read to find out interesting things. And we really need to emphasize that for kids. And there are lots of different ways in which we can make these maps. By the way, we have a whole set of them with related pictures at Text Project in a project called Word Pictures. So I welcome you to come to Text Project. What I've said today is that reading stamina is what is the really critical proficiency that our kids are struggling with at this point. What I've said is it's not that they can't recognize words, it's that they haven't read enough to get really good at it. And they also haven't had the reading stamina task scaffolded for them. They actually haven't been engaged and taught how to read silently. I'm saying this is something that's teachable. I've edited a book that, like everything at Text Project, is available for open access, and here's the URL. Yes, it does cost something at Amazon. You can't get anything on Amazon without charging something. So I'd recommend that you go to some of these other sites. So Rebecca, it's time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Freddie. We do have a couple questions that have come in, so let me go ahead and get started with this question from Wendy in the audience. She's asking, I agree with everything that has been shared today. As a part of MTSS and IEP goals, we have students with goals set specifically for comprehension, especially inferential skills, because they have demonstrated good rate and accuracy fluency, but not comprehension. How can we monitor for these students?
So Mark, do you want to take that?
I don't know how much I can say about that other than that the comprehension on the Silent Reading Fluency measure is something that is accessible. It's relatively easy and a low bar for students who are having problems to begin with and have an opportunity to show growth. But Freddie, you probably have better answers here.
Well, I mean, the question of how would you keep track of kids on comprehension, I mean, that could be a whole seminar here. And I would really, we've got some video courses and sessions with people like David Pearson on our Text Project YouTube site. But I would really recommend thinking, I mean, the magazine articles could be a really good way in which you could track students' comprehension. You could also be tracking, I mean, a really big part of comprehension is background knowledge. So if you haven't built up bodies of background knowledge, it's going to be really hard for you to comprehend new topics. So another aspect of comprehension is keeping track of what it is that I'm learning, which is one of the reasons I'm really pushing these semantic or concept maps. So both of those things that I've talked about today, I think, can be ways to help kids become more aware of their own comprehension. So at some point, it's not just the teacher tracking comprehension, it's also how am I becoming more conscious? And we've talked a lot about whether if we would put something on this silent reading fluency assessment to talk directly to kids about their thinking as they're reading, would that be something that would be helpful? Kids need to become aware of their own comprehension. So thank you for the question.
I have another thought about that, which is, we have this striking finding that the same students who might have had poor comprehension when it was online and they were performing independently were able to comprehend at a much higher level, show much better comprehension in the one-on-one setting, which simply indicates that their initial poor comprehension was not due to inability. And so I guess I would think, wonder how much do we really know about why a student is demonstrating poor comprehension, and are there motivational self-awareness factors that are important in addition to, or perhaps instead of, factors that are more cognitive and more skill related, so that I would imagine that an approach that reinforcing, Freddie, what you just said, that raises students' focus and awareness and attention to their own comprehension with materials that don't present necessarily a comprehension challenge, but require students to develop better habits of comprehending, would be a way to proceed.
All right. Thank you very much for that. We've gotten a couple more questions, and I certainly encourage anyone that has a question, you still have time, definitely send those in to me. We'll try to get to them here now. All right. The next question is coming from Kimberly, and she's asking, if a student reads at a lower grade level, for example, special education, can we adjust the grade level on the SRF rather than keep them at that high grade level?
I don't know if that's, I'd have to defer if there's anyone on the call from, on the line from the aimsweb program side who could say whether that's feasible. That would be good. From the point of view of it would mean that the normative scores would not work, but it would certainly be a good thing to do from a progress monitoring point of view.
And yes, for progress monitoring, you can do that. This is Maura. I just wanted to say you can do that. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Maura. Thank you. All right. Let me go on to the next question again here. Let's see. A couple extra questions coming in now. I think there's actually just a lot of comments coming in, people kind of putting in their 2 cents saying yes to your question. You can conduct a serve level assessment at a lower grade level. So that's helpful. Thanks everyone in the audience for being on top of that. I'm also getting a lot of questions, and I just want to address this quickly before anyone has to hop off, that we are sending a copy of this recording out. I've gotten tons of questions on that. You will have that in your hands in the next few days, so if you want to share with colleagues or reference anything that was talked about today, you'll certainly be able to do that. All right, it looks like this final question that's come in is actually just asking if this is intended to be used as a universal screening for all students or only for students that we have some concerns about.
For all students, and certainly for the great majority of students for whom comprehension is high, it provides a good indicator of reading ability through the rate score.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Before I turn it back over to Freddie or Mark for any closing thoughts, I just wanted to remind you that you will get a copy of the recording, and we certainly appreciate your time today, and Freddie and Mark for your expertise as well. We thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to the both of you for any closing thoughts.
Freddie?
Well, I just want to reiterate this notion, and especially with that question about is it for some or all. I think as an overall goal, this issue of stamina in silent reading is something that we really need to put at the center of our reading programs. So thanks for your attention and thanks for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.